Here's the thing, I am not here to tell you to just get over it. That's never been helpful for anyone. Your feelings are valid. The fear and anxiety that you might be experiencing after having a stroke is valid. What I would like to do in today's video is something more productive, which is to help you change your mindset so that fear doesn't completely rule your life. And as someone with a generalized anxiety disorder, a history of panic disorder, agoraphobia, and trauma, I also want you to know that you're not alone and that mental health recovery is possible. So in today's video, I'm going to cover some ways that will help you conquer your fear and live life with more joy. So the first thing that I want you to understand is that having fear and anxiety after a stroke is normal. It's typical and it's understandable that you might be experiencing that after having a stroke or if your loved one had a stroke. The American Heart Association actually reported that around 20% of stroke survivors have increased anxiety or post-stroke anxiety after a stroke. Personally, I think that number is grossly underreported. The clients that I have worked with across all sorts of different settings, home health care, skilled nursing facilities, teletherapy, and then my engagement in social media groups has taught me that many more than 20% of survivors are dealing with post-stroke anxiety. So I want you to know it's normal. Why is it normal? Because having a stroke is a life-threatening, life-changing traumatic event. You were likely in the hospital for some period of time. You may have even gone through inpatient rehab or rehab at a skilled nursing facility. And it kind of completely upends life the way that you knew it. So that trauma and dealing with that, you're bound to have increased fear and anxiety because having a stroke is just a traumatic thing to happen to anyone. Now, that fear can present itself in a few different ways. The most common one I hear is fear of having another stroke. And that's valid because you don't want to go through everything that you just went through before. That is a scary thought. There also is a fear around living with maybe the disability, whether it's physical, mental, cognitive, emotional, for the rest of your life and it not getting any better. I hear that a lot as well. I also hear fear of just general death and dying, and I think that's just something that we as humans have to contend with and deal with and face, and it's not an easy thing to think about for many of us. So this is kind of the first step, is just recognizing that if you're feeling any of those, if any of those triggers for your fear are getting brought up right now, that's understandable and that's okay. We're gonna talk about some ways that we can conquer those fears. Now that you understand that fear is a normal, if uncomfortable, response to having a stroke, I think it's also important to really dig into what fear actually is and what it stems from. Now, I'm not talking about the fear of everything, of spiders, of bees, of heights. Those are things that we each have that's very individualized. I'm talking about specific fear after stroke, health-related fear. And I think it really comes down to primarily two things. One is feeling a lack of control over your life or the circumstances that you find yourself in. The second thing is dealing with uncertainty, particularly about future events. I think many stroke survivors are afraid of having a secondary stroke because it's uncertain. It's something that could happen, but it's not something that you can pin down and say, yep, that'll definitely happen. So that unpredictability, that uncertainty can weigh on us. Also the uncertainty of kind of just knowing what the future holds. And for anybody with just generalized anxiety disorder, hello, that's something that we tend to worry about anyway. So if you started out with an anxiety issue prior to having a stroke, it may be worse now. This feeling of fear can lead to just kind of an underlying chronic state of stress. It can also lead to a chronic feeling of just being overwhelmed. which is not a very nice feeling. And it's important to know that we all have feelings of fear and anxiety from time to time, but when we start letting those feelings rule our life and make decisions for us, that's when it becomes a problem. Now that we've talked about what fear is and where it usually stems from with health-related anxiety, I want to talk about one of the best tools that we have to actually conquer fear, which is cognitive behavioral therapy or cognitive behavioral treatment. It's also known as CBT. And I like it because it has a lot of evidence and research backing its efficacy or showing that it's effective for treating fear and anxiety. Now, there's not a lot of research around using CBT specifically with stroke survivors, but there's not a lot of research in general about treating mental health in stroke survivors. Anecdotally, it has worked very well for me with my own anxiety disorder, my panic disorder, and agoraphobia, as well as for many of the clients that I have worked with post-stroke. So let's talk about what it actually is, and then we'll talk about implementing some of the strategies to help you conquer your fear. Let's dive a little deeper into cognitive behavioral therapy. So this is probably best viewed as a diagram. So I'm gonna draw out a little triangle here, and at the top, I'm gonna write in thoughts. One corner, I'm gonna put emotions and feelings, and then in the last corner, I'm gonna write out behaviors. So I'm drawing little arrows here to note that these all have an influence on each other. They are interactional. And I want to give you an example, a personal example, that I feel a little bit vulnerable sharing, but I think it's important to set an example. I will share something about my mental health with you. So when I was in the really early phases of my agoraphobia, which means that I was fearful of leaving my house, it was very difficult. My thought was, if I leave the house, what if something happens, right? That what if spiral. What if something happens and I'm not able to get to a hospital if something goes wrong? My emotion then was increased anxiety and fear, and my behavior was that I didn't leave my house except to do necessary things. So that was a self-perpetuating cycle where I'd have the thought, the emotion would come up, and then I would limit myself and I would stop doing things that I enjoyed. Now, over time, that got a little bit easier. So as I started to step more outside of my comfort zone, for a while, I couldn't leave my immediate city. When that got a little bit better, for my honeymoon, my husband and I went to Savannah, Georgia, which was a 6-hour drive away. That was my first big trip away from my hometown. That was about a year and a half after my initial panic attack and bout with agoraphobia. Then in 2017, yes, that was 3 years later, I was finally able to fly by myself to California to go see my friend graduate with his master's degree. Did I have a panic attack on the flight? Yes, I did. But did I make it anyway? Yes, I did. So I used cognitive behavioral therapy to help me overcome those challenges and work my way through this process to not let those negative thoughts and negative emotions influence my behavior in a way that kept me restricted from doing what I loved. I want you to know that it's not easy. I mean, you can see it took me, 2012 was when I had my initial panic attack and then anxiety spiraling out of control, to 2017 when I was able to actually take a flight by myself. It's a process. Like with any part of stroke recovery, especially if you're thinking physically, you know those things don't happen overnight, and it's the same with mental health. It takes a lot of work, it takes active effort, day in, day out, but it is possible, and it gets better over time the more work that you put into it. Recognize that during this process, especially at the beginning, you may start to feel more fear and anxiety up front, and that's likely because you are no longer suppressing those feelings, you're no longer distracting yourself from those feelings or restricting enjoyable things that you used to like. Rather, you're facing these things head on. So it is normal to feel more fear and anxiety in the first place. You have the opportunity to work with a professional on this. That's definitely the best way to do it, but I am gonna give you some tips on what you can do at home to really conquer your fear. All right, let's get to the good stuff. How to actually implement cognitive behavioral therapy techniques in day-to-day life to conquer your fear. I'll walk you through 6 steps that you can take. The first one is to know your why. Why are you coming up against and challenging this fear now? Is it because fear interrupts your day-to-day life? Is it because it keeps you from being with people that you care about? Is it that it keeps you from doing things that you love or going places? These are all really valid reasons for wanting to implement this, and it's important to keep the why at the forefront of your brain when things get hard. Which leads me to step number 2. Recognize that it is hard work. Just like with physical rehab, working through mental health issues takes hard work day in and day out. So it's not going to be a cakewalk, but if you continue to push through, you will see progress. The third step is to recognize what you can change and, more importantly, what you can't. That's a toughie. There is something called the Serenity Prayer that's often said in 12-step rehabilitation programs for addiction, but I think it really applies here as well. So it goes something like this. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change what I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I think at the end of the day, it's important to realize that we're only in control of ourselves and what we do. And we can become more in control of how our thoughts impact how we feel, and then how we behave based on those feelings and thoughts. Step number 4 is probably the most important, and it is to pay attention to your thoughts and challenge them. So anytime that you start feeling fearful or anxious and you don't know what's going on and your thoughts are just flooding and twirling around in your brain, stop. Stop for a moment, take a deep breath, pay attention to that thought or that feeling. Why are you feeling that way? Is your response, is that overwhelming, fearful response really appropriate? If you're thinking about going and doing something, is it really a situation that's going to put you in danger or cause your health to deteriorate? Go through a process where you begin to question your thoughts versus letting your emotions and your thoughts spiral out of control. Step 5 is to differentiate between motivation and intention. And what I mean by this is you will likely feel motivated after watching this video. At least I hope you do. Motivation isn't inherently a bad thing, but we know that motivation fails us at some point. At some point, we're not motivated. We don't feel like doing whatever we're doing or challenging ourselves or putting in the hard work. So what do we do? How do we continue to challenge ourselves when motivation isn't enough? And the answer there is to set intentions, specifically implementation intentions. And this is a phrase that's used in habit science research. It has been shown that setting implementation intentions is much more effective than solely relying on motivation, which we know will fail us. So what is an implementation intention? It's basically a very specific way to set a goal. So when you're thinking about what you're wanting to do, if you're wanting to challenge your thoughts more, if you're wanting to go out and be more social, or you want to try something again that you love that you haven't been doing because of fear, set an implementation intention. How do we do this? Think about why you want to do it, then get very specific. Where will you do it? When will you do it? And I mean very specific. Will you do it in the morning, in the evening? What day of the week? Multiple days of the week? How will you do it? Be specific about that. And that leads us into our last step, which is to set small goals. Notice the very important word, small. Setting small goals is of utmost importance because we tend to set very lofty goals for ourselves that, let's be real, we never meet. When we go too big, we sometimes get overwhelmed with just trying to think about meeting that goal. And that's not the point here. The point here is to make things achievable in small steps, small bites. So set something achievable and realistic, something that you think you can really do, maybe within the next couple of weeks. So for me, we'll go back to my mental health story. You know, it took me a year and a half to be able to travel 6 hours away from my hometown. And it took me another 4 years to be able to go on a flight by myself. So it took a lot of work in those years for me to be at the point where I felt relatively comfortable doing something like that. And even then, I still had a panic attack on the flight by myself. I made it. I used my techniques, slow, deep breathing, reminding myself that I wasn't dying, I was going to be okay. But it takes work every day, putting in, just like physical rehab does. But I promise you that if you put in the work, you will see progress and you will live life with more joy. All right, everyone, that's it for today. What ways have you found to be helpful in dealing with fear and anxiety after stroke? Leave me a comment down below and let me know. I love to hear from you guys. As always, I will leave a link down in the description to sign up for my email list where I send out 3 stroke recovery tips a week, and that includes some motivational emails as well in case you need a little bit of a boost. It also gets you access to my free ebook, The Stroke Recovery Pocket Guide, if you need a little more support. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.